Hello and welcome to the International Daily Roundup, where we bring you some of the top stories from across the globe. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Sri Lankan election body gives green light to president for snap election 6 months ahead of schedule. Greek police standoff at the Turkish border as Erdogan unleashes new refugee crisis. Israelis vote for the third time in 1 year to elect a new parliament. Uruguayans rise in protest as right-wing president takes oath. New Malaysian Prime Minister takes over even as Parliament remains divided. Let's begin with the first story. Sri Lanka is readying up for an early parliamentary election months ahead of schedule. The chairman of the National Election Commission stated that, according to existing provisions, the president can dissolve the parliament once it has finished 4.5 years of its tenure. The current parliament finished this time on March 1st, which was yesterday. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is speculated to call for snap elections which can favour the Sri Lankan Pudujana Perumane led by his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa. To talk more about this, we have with us Anish. So Anish, can you first tell us why has the president taken this decision or is thinking of calling for snap elections now and dissolving the parliament?
Well, we have to look at the electoral records of Rajapaksa's party, which is the Pudujana Peramana. And in the last year, the local bodies election and also the presidential election, they actually did quite well. In fact, in the local bodies election, if I'm not wrong, they got somewhere around 2/3 of all the seats that were up for vote. And in the presidential election even, as we saw, Sajid Premadasa, who came in second from Vikramasinghe's party, he was way behind Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and that shows that at this point the Perimana actually gets a wide range of support from across Sri Lanka, especially the Sinhala heartlands, and this at a time like this they can actually win a proper majority without interference from smaller parties.
So how do you see this whole process of calling for early elections? And especially also with respect to this 19A amendment, which was introduced by the earlier government of Vikramasinghe, which was to curtail excessive powers of the presidency. Is this whole process democratic? How do you see it?
Democratic is a very you have to really fine tune the question, because when we look at it, the process, as we can see, is legal, in the sense that it's not an excessive use of the government's or the president's power, to put it rather, and the president can actually call for an election within 6 months of the expiry of the tenure of the parliament. Now that can mean any time within the 6 months, which can be at the end of this month or be in December when it was scheduled for. We have to say that the president hasn't called for it yet. So the controversy, it can be, but if a decision of that kind is taken, it can be controversial. It can be taken very seriously by the opposition, which is not prepared right now to take on the president's party. And there might be court cases, and that will probably talk about the more specific details of what the president can and cannot do when it comes to dealing with the parliament and the parliamentary majority, especially when calling for elections and dissolving the parliament. In this case, but democratic is a different question. It's definitely unilateral if such a decision is taken, because the majority still wouldn't want an election. We have to understand that. And so it is a unilateral decision by default is not democratic, right? Really, but does it go with the principle of the constitution is a different question. And legality is on the side of the president, but democratically speaking, it shouldn't be ideally done.
So what would, if these elections do happen, what would it mean for Sri Lanka now?
So if an election of this kind actually happens, we can look forward to a government run by the two Rajapaksa brothers. Mahinda Rajapaksa can come back to power. We know in 2018 he tried to become the prime minister in a very with provisions that had already expired and were taken out by the parliament through constitutional amendments. You'd remember, I mean, we all remember how Sri Lanka had two prime ministers, effectively speaking, both with their own party members holding a veritable blockade on the capital, trying to prove themselves right. So that has happened. We had the court cases where the president cannot unilaterally decide on matters. So, of course, that matter comes back here. We see Mahinda Rajapaksa coming up more victorious in recent endeavors in getting popular support. His party is quite popular. It has hit the right chord of Sinhala nationalism that if not a majority, but a large number of people do accept, and in the elections it can actually come in favor of them. So the previous cases of corruption, of wrongdoings in the government, especially when dealing with trade and trade deals with different countries, that will not really come up in the question in the election. So what does a Rajapaksa, if an election happens, the question should be what does a Rajapaksa government would mean?
Yeah.
And the legacy of Rajapaksa has not been very comforting to look at, to be honest. We are talking about the Sri Lankan civil war and the way it ended with the tremendous amount of war crimes that took place under the government, under the watch of Rajapaksa presidency, is something that has disturbed not just Sri Lankan people, but people across the world. You had a veritable unity among both within Rajapaksa's party and the opposition coming together to oppose him, to bring him down, to bring him to record. And so the efforts to actually although the efforts to reconcile those, to reconcile with the victims, to bring justice to the war crimes has not really begun. But we can definitely say under Rajapaksa that is never going to happen, for sure. Rajapaksa has also, been somebody who is averse to international legal strictures and sanctions on various things, including torture and genocide. And the country has recently withdrawn from the UNHCR resolution on genocide, in fact. So we are looking at a very different time to come. And even if the election doesn't happen very soon, it's not going. The popularity is not dwindling.
Yeah.
So if it keeps growing, we can look for a Rajapaksa's hold back in power by next year for sure.
Thank you, Anish, for talking to us. And moving on to our second story, the refugee crisis in the eastern Mediterranean continues. Greek police and Syrian asylum-seekers standoff continues in eastern Thrace, in Greece and its many islands, as the Erdogan government has transported tens of thousands of refugees to the Greek-Turkish border. Following the recent losses to its invading forces in Idlib, the Turkish government reprimanded the European Union for the cold shoulder treatment on the matter. The Erdogan government also indicated that they are no longer obliged to restrain refugees unless the EU safeguards Turkish interests in the Syrian war. A 2016 agreement between the EU and Turkey offered the latter financial support to absorb the incoming refugees fleeing the war in Syria en route to Europe. Since Friday, there have been massive surges in border crossings through maritime and land routes between Turkey and Greece. Conditions on the land border between Turkey and Greece have become very sensitive, especially at Kastanis, as thousands of refugees have breached the border to cross into Greece. On March 1st, Sunday, the conservative New Democracy government decided to suspend new asylum applications and strengthen the security deployment at Kastanis border to check such a major influx of refugees into the country. Moving on to Israel, Israelis are voting to elect a new parliament today on March 2nd. This is the third election to the Knesset in less than a year, the last two being held in April and September of 2019. According to public opinion surveys, no party or coalition is expected to win a majority of 61 seats in a 120-member Knesset. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party is leading in the opinion polls. However, the current coalition of right-wing and ultra-right parties is also expected to fall short of a majority. They currently hold 56 seats in the Knesset. The main opposition, led by Benny Gantz, Blue and White, is expected to get support from left Zionist parties, Labour and Meretz. Even they are predicted to fall short of a majority. The Joint List, a coalition of left-wing and pro-Arab parties, is expected to emerge as the third largest party in the Knesset, with polls predicting 14 to 15 seats. As per surveys, a significant shift from the traditional left Zionist voters is expected to work in favor of the list. The shift is being attributed to the ideological compromises made by the Israeli left parties in the past few years. Left parties such as Meretz and Labour have failed to counter the rise of Jewish supremacist and ultranationalist politics that has come to dominate the country's politics. And now going to Uruguay, Luis Lacalle Pou of the right-wing Partido Nacional, or the National Party, assumed the presidency of Uruguay on March 1st. He was welcomed with massive protests in the national capital, Montevideo. Hundreds of protesters demonstrated outside the legislative palace where Lacalle Pou swore in as president. Protesters also rejected the presence of the far-right and fascist leaders accused of being complicit in mass murder in Latin America, who were invited to the swearing-in. The foreign leaders against whom slogans were raised included Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, Chilean President Sebastián Piñera, Colombian President Iván Duque, and recently coup-installed President of Bolivia, Jeanine Áñez. The Communist Party and other social movements of Uruguay, who gave the call for the protest, also criticized the non-invitation of the socialist presidents of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, arguing that the protocol ceremony was not a family party. Another massive mobilization was held at Liberator Avenue in the city, organized by the mothers and families of the detained and disappeared Uruguayans. Hundreds of relatives of the people detained and disappeared during the civic-military dictatorship demonstrated with placards and photographs of their lost family members. The families are still fighting for a proper indictment into the crimes of the dictatorship. They fear the investigation would be hindered during the rule of the new right-wing government. Finally, Malaysia has a new prime minister. Former cabinet minister and leader of the Bersatu, Muhyiddin Yassin, took the oath today. Muhyiddin was a surprise candidate put forward by the Barisan National Alliance, led by the scandal-ridden United Malays National Organization, or the UMNO. His ascent came as the former ruling coalition, Pakatan Harapan, was going through an internal power struggle between its two major leaders, Mahathir Mohamad and Anwar Ibrahim. Mahathir was the Pakatan Harapan Prime Minister until February 24th, when he filed his resignation from both the Prime Ministership and the leadership of the Malaya United Indigenous Party, or Bersatu. The leadership tussle for the nation's top post between Anwar and Mahathir was the reason behind the resignation. Mahathir is speculated to have intended to form a new ruling coalition or trigger an early general election. His resignation also triggered the breaking away of Bersatu from Pakatan Harapan. On Saturday, hours after both Anwar and Mahathir made peace and publicly agreed to continue the latter's tenure as the Prime Minister, Bersatu, along with Barisan Nasional and the Islamist Gagasan Sejahtera, filed Muhyiddin's nomination. The office of the Yang di Pertuan Agong, the nation's elected constitutional monarch, promptly appointed him to the post pending a confidence vote in the lower house of the parliament. Muhyiddin has also secured conditional support from smaller regional parties from the eastern provinces of Sabah and Sarawak. And this is all we have in this episode of the International Daily Roundup. For more such stories and videos, visit our website peoplesdispatch.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for watching.